background. We can pull the lights down as well. Today we wrap up our Lifelines series with a reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Paul writes to that church in Corinth, he says, "For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free of God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings." This is God's story, our story. Thanks be to God. So we wrap up 1 Corinthians, our study, this 4 or 5 week series on 1 Corinthians this week. Next week we move into a month-long study on 2 Corinthians. The month of July will be in the book of Job. If you know the book of Job, it's a tough one to wrap our minds around. We'll be in that. But today we find ourselves, this Lifelines series, wrapping up this brief series on 1 Corinthians. Now, what do we find in today's text as we take a look at 1 Corinthians? It's hard not to think about Paul, the author of this letter to the church in Corinth, about his life, his story, this Damascus Road experience where he is blinded by Christ and turns over this incredible new leaf from persecuting Christians to becoming this core of first century Christianity. We find in his letter today, in this brief few verses, what he was working towards. A ministry of fulfillment to all people, to Jews and to Gentiles, to those that are weak. We see he's preaching for the sake of the gospel. You know, to start out, if you're filling out your homework that was in, or your blanks that are in your At One Weekly this week, this is a really important thing that I want us, we're not going to focus on, but I think it's important to recognize Paul's an overachiever. Let's face it. Talking about I have become all things to all people, I'm going around, he is a tent maker by trade, right? If you didn't know that, Paul was a tent maker by trade. He was also this expert in Jewish law, served a part of the Jewish council, was traveling all around the world. He was one of those guys who's probably talented at everything, and he makes you sick, right? You know those people in your life. They just can do anything. They're a great cook, or they're have an incredible singing voice, whatever it might be. Paul was probably one of these kinds of people. And we see this overachieving in 1 Corinthians 9:22. I have become all things to all people. That's a pretty lofty expectation. I can tell you, in ministry circles for pastors and ministry professionals, this is like our nightmare verse. Because let's face it, what we expect out of our pastor, out of our church staff people, is to be all things to all people, right? I need to hear the perfect sermon or have the perfect study or whatever it might be. That's a tough thing to live up to. Paul sets a really high bar. So listen, as much as we want to focus on this verse, we're not going to this week. There's plenty more things in these verses to spend our time on. If you're a confirmand, get ready to get confirmed. Don't make this your confirmation verse. There's so many more options, all right? So as we joke through that, what are we going to spend our time on? We're going to spend our time in 1 Corinthians 9:19. and really focus on two words. It seems apropos on a Memorial Day weekend to talk about two words in particular. Paul says, "For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them." Free and slave. We deal with these dichotomies, these opposites all the time as people of faith, right? The epitome of it for Lutherans is being sinner and saint at the same time. We talk about death and life. And today we talk about freedom and slavery. And listen, this isn't the only time that these terms, these themes are used in Scripture. This is something in the New Testament especially, and particularly in Paul's writings that he talks about over and over and over again. Freedom and slavery. What we're free to do and what we're bound by. We look at Jesus' words in John 8:36. "So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." In our Lutheran understanding of Scripture, we often talk about freedom from what? Three different things. Freedom from sin, freedom from death, and freedom from the power of the devil. Jesus is saying, you know what? You are no longer bound by those things. You're no longer bound by a sinful nature. You are no longer slaves to fear of death because I have overcome death. You are no longer bound by the fact that there is someone working against you because you have an advocate on this earth who's even greater, even more powerful. We are free from sin, death, and the power of the devil. Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5, he says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Sin is a trap. It so easily entangles. It pulls us back in. Paul reminds us, you may be free, but this isn't a freedom to take lightly. It is not a freedom to give up easily. Keep holding fast to it. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, just a few chapters before our reading today, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." It's like God's own nature, God's way of being, God's intention for us in this world is freedom. God's intention for us in this world is freedom. Listen, it sounds pretty simple when we lay it out like that. I mean, I could just put a nice little period on the end, we'll have a bow, and then we'll call it a day with the sermon there. But it's more complicated than that. Freedom isn't so simple. And if you're filling out your blanks, this one should come as no surprise. It's because freedom comes at a great price. Or as we say, freedom isn't free. Freedom comes at a great price. We as Americans, we recognize that this weekend, tomorrow. We recognize, we honor the fact that over 1 million Americans in the course of our 200-year history have given their lives to ensure unparalleled freedoms. The roots of our country, this foundation, is for our freedom to come here on Sunday morning and say, "God, we love you," and not worry about being persecuted because of it. We have unparalleled freedoms. It got me thinking about, I haven't served in the military, but I've always had a heart for it. I remember at my home congregation, and they still do it today, that every Memorial Day they open up the very large cemetery that's right next door to the church. And I was talking to my grandfather last night, and he was out there working, and they just welcome people every Memorial Day weekend to come put flags or flowers, whatever it might be, to memorialize. And I remember being out there when I was like 8 or 9 or 10 years old and being moved at that point in my life by those that came to honor those that had served. I looked up a little bit of the history of Memorial Day weekend. Memorial Day is a holiday, and there have been a few iterations of Memorial Day before we came to this last Monday of May. One in particular struck me, and it was just after the Civil War in May of 1865. Outside Charleston, South Carolina, if you know Charleston, that was the start of the Civil War in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter. At the end of the war, there was a camp where Confederate soldiers kept imprisoned Union soldiers at this racetrack, this horse racetrack. And because of disease and malnourishment, over 250 Union soldiers died at this site. At the end of the war, they were quickly buried in unmarked graves. But people knew this, and the slaves knew this. So just after the Civil War had ended in May of 1865, freed African Americans went and buried them properly. And then there came a day where they honored them with a march at that grounds, at that track of over 10,000 people, primarily African American, but also Northern missionaries and teachers. And they came there and they honored those that had fallen, that had given their lives for the sake of freedom. They went and honored their brothers and sisters that had given their life with flowers, with tears. There were, including in this 10,000 or 3,000 students, I think, African American students that had just started in school and knew because what they were able to do with education was because of those that fought for deserved freedom. And, I think this leads me to a poignant question. What do we do with our freedom? What do we do with our freedom? It's become commonplace, right? That Memorial Day is like the start of summer. You go to the pool or you cook out. This is how we celebrate having an extra day off of work or whatever. How is it that we honor those sons and daughters that have given their life? We look at those flags that are out front. We see the names on the flags, those that have served, those that have even given their life for the sake of our freedom. We thank God for those sons and daughters that we're willing to serve. We give thanks to God for that one son in particular that gave his life not for just freedom for those within our country's borders, but also freedom for all people for all time. We come today, what a great way to worship God in coming to his house and offering thanks for the freedom that we have. So Paul, this overachiever, he was able to wrap his mind around freedom. He says this in Galatians 5:13, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another." Is there anything more godly, more Christ-like that we can do with our time, the resources, what God has given us, our freedom, than to serve each other? I invite you this weekend to find some time to thank God for the freedoms that you have. To thank God for the sons and daughters of this country that have ensured those freedoms. To thank God for his son for freedom from sin, death, and the devil. In the midst of that prayer, think, God, what is it you want me to do with my life, with my freedom? Amen.